Most people have no idea that Apple's first factory outside of the US was in Ireland, and the second one was in Singapore. It was 1981 and Apple decided that it needed an Asian factory. How did Singapore, a tiny red dot, outcompete every other country and snipe that deal? Today, we're going to deep dive into the 3-rule playbook that helped Singapore master the art of courting and winning over Apple and some of the largest companies in the world. Let's wind the clock back. What was Singapore like in 1981? Singapore was still a developing country. It was hungry and looking for investments from all corners of the world. The Economic Development Board, better known as the EDB, was the de facto salesman of Singapore. The EDB sent young officers all over the world. Wherever there was an investment opportunity, EDB would be there. America, Europe, and Japan. This hustle had brought Singapore's unemployment down from 14% after independence in 1965 to around 4% in the 1980s and saved Singapore from collapsing. EDB's 3-rule playbook was critical here. Let's dive into the first rule. In the 1970s and 80s, American and European companies were being outcompeted by the Japanese. Companies were weighing up options for offshoring, lowering costs to win back market share. Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea emerged as the potential locations. They were also known as the 4 Asian Tigers. Even with the push factor, Singapore was keenly aware that winning over foreign investments wasn't easy, especially in Southeast Asia, which was rife with geopolitical turmoil. Indonesia invaded East Timor in 1975, and Vietnam had invaded Cambodia in 1978. The region wasn't exactly the paragon of peace, and most businessmen hated wars. To counter this, the EDB officers thought out of the box and sent its own ministers and ambassadors to equip foreign investors with the knowledge to navigate geopolitical uncertainties in the region. Businessmen first had to understand Southeast Asia before they would consider an investment in Singapore. The last thing they want is wars or riots in the region, tanking their investments, which already takes years to recoup. Lee Kuan Yew likened Singapore to Venice for assurances. In Renaissance Europe, in spite of the turmoil around it, Venice flourished like a shining star. Singapore was promised to be a haven of peace and progress in a sea of uncertainty and risks. And here, we have the first rule of Singapore's corporate courtship playbook. Never leave room for uncertainty. Singapore sought certainty in an uncertain region. Now that Singapore has got the ball rolling, it needed to move fast to bring in the big brand names to establish itself as the place to manufacture in Asia. So it has sent officers all over the world to learn the intricacies of every industry. This formed a global network of EDB officers sending field reports to each other, keeping their fingers on the pulse of any new developments. This was how EDB heard that Fairchild Semiconductors made a commitment to manufacture their products in Hong Kong, and EDB immediately wanted to get in on the action. So they reached out to Representative K.C. Shum. He was stationed in San Francisco to market Singapore-manufactured plywood to America's building industry. Plywood, you might ask. Singapore back then was desperate to export any products it could. Shum talked to Fairchild. How about you guys give us a shot? But Fairchild simply ghosted EDB. So he approached other semiconductor companies in the area. Surely, there were a couple more that were keen to offshore. And then he found National Semiconductor. They made the trip to Singapore and were convinced, expecting production to start in 2 months. But guess what? Singapore helped them to do it in 2 weeks. Yes, 2 weeks. National Semiconductor did not have the time to build their own plant, so Singapore offered its own manufacturing premises to them. Being able to start production so soon meant that National Semiconductors started manufacturing in Singapore even before Fairchild started manufacturing in Hong Kong. This blew the competition away. Silicon Valley was royally shocked when news of National Semiconductor spread. Fairchild then got back to EDB. Sorry, I left you on red. They wasted no time and set up shop in Singapore too. And this brings us to the second rule of the Singapore's corporate courtship playbook. Execute with ruthless efficiency. Singapore's speed, due to its nimble size, became its strategy. The news of National and Fairchild Semiconductor reached Apple's ears too. At this time, Apple had only existed for 5 years, far from the 3.3 trillion behemoth it is today. It had just gone public with a blockbuster IPO in the 1980s and was known for its Apple II microcomputer with premium offerings like color graphics, sound, and a first spreadsheet. But Apple could not afford to get comfy. Hot on its heels were the other two largest microcomputer companies, Radio Shack and Commodore. Apple had to expand its market fast, building its first overseas operations plant in Ireland in the 1980s. But that wasn't enough. To become a global force, Apple knew that it had to have the Asian market too. EDB wasted no time and led the charge by offering Apple tax holidays, no corporate taxes for a number of years, and cheap land, an offer that was too good to refuse. But the managing director of Apple Singapore, John Sanders, didn't have a good impression when he first landed in the country. He recounted that when he arrived at the airport at 3 AM in March 1981, him and his finance managers were immediately regretful because it was old, tacky, and dirty. This was before the opening of the glamorous Changi Airport that is world-renowned today. Singapore was still relying on the old Paya Lebar Airport. The duo were met by KC Teo from EDB despite it being 3 AM, a hospitality gesture extended by EDB officers. They were whisked to their hotel and briefed about the busy schedule planned for the following day. The distasteful first impression was slowly being unwound. EDB helped Apple to speedrun the entire process. When Sanders arrived, he expected that it would take at least 6 months to get the building ready. But imagine his surprise when he came back 2 months later on an unscheduled trip. The building was almost ready. This time, Sanders could not hold back praise for Singapore. You guys are really something else. You work faster than they do in Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley is already the fastest in the US. By July 1981, the Apple factory was in production. First with 2K units. Production doubled every month until 32K units. Sanders was a full 6 months ahead of planning. By October, he was so confident about his plant's progress that he scheduled for Apple's president and CEO, Mr. Makula, to visit. Steve Jobs was chairman of the board at that time and wouldn't become CEO of Apple until his eventual return to the company in the late 1990s. When Apple's CEO visited, the Singapore plant had yields far surpassing its Dallas factory. Singapore had quality level yield of 80% or more. Dallas, 50% or less. Sanders further improved yields to 99.3%. They were so successful that the Apple CEO wanted to shift all manufacturing operations to Singapore. At its peak in the 1980s and 1990s, Apple employed hundreds of employees in Singapore, getting costs down, which helped Apple be successful against its competitors. And this is the third and most important rule of Singapore's corporate courtship playbook: overpromise and overdeliver. Singapore's real genius was in far surpassing the demands of corporates. It understood that tax holidays and cheap land were just the beginning to make offshoring efforts financially attractive. And this sums up the 3-rule playbook that helped Singapore and EDB land Apple and other major companies. Today, Apple's presence in Singapore has transformed from manufacturing to higher value activities. Singapore now serves as Apple's regional headquarters for Southeast Asia, housing multiple functions like the Regional Operations Center, R&D, data center, and its flagship retail outlets. Apple has continued investing in Singapore with a recent $250 million R&D focused investment on upgrading its advanced engineering capabilities and AI, ML learning infrastructure. So next time you're at any of the flagship stores in Marina Bay Sands or Orchard Road, remember that it's the culmination of efforts started by EDB all the way back in the 1970s.
In the next video, we'll talk about the mastermind behind the EDB, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, the man that Lee Kuan Yew would be lost without. See you there.